Hello and welcome to Inside the Future Teachers Studio. I'm your host, Alex, and this evening we will be interviewing USC MAT candidate Alex Dwyer about his personal teaching pedagogy. Hello, Alex, and welcome to the show.
Alex, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. A culturally and developmentally accessible pedagogical approach centered on content that develops specific academic language presented in a manner that fosters intrigue and excitement for students. An approach that explores student understanding of English language arts literacy. That is the pedagogy that I want to employ in my future English language arts classroom.
Alex, could you synthesize all the concepts that you have engaged with over your time preparing to be an educator and make connections between your personal pedagogy practices and the English language arts? Interesting. Can you say a little bit more about that pedagogical stance in terms of students developing content understanding?
Oh, absolutely. Students must be presented prompts that are aligned and build to an overarching understanding that ties together lessons, units, and ultimately the entire school year. To make those overarching connections to an understanding based in ELA, students must be presented with prompts that they can engage with that are both culturally relatable and developmentally appropriate. An aligned presentation of strong ELA contents that is relatable and accessible and presented to students in a manner that creates excitement for the student as they gain ELA literacy is exactly how I want to teach.
Okay. Literacy is an interesting idea in terms of teaching. Are you speaking of students being literate, as in they can read and write the English language, or something else?
Well, being able to read and write in English is definitely a form of literacy that has a place in the ELA classroom, but literacy in terms of ELA goes beyond that. Students need to be literate in textual synthesis, drawing from multiple platforms to create a distinct theme or stance. There also has to be argumentative literacy, where students are able to present and defend an idea using or drawing on different texts through the literary synthesis, which I just spoke about. Those are main literacies in ELA, synthesis and argumentative literacy that students must continually work to develop along with the English language literacy, which you mentioned before, which is understanding and using the English language.
Fascinating. Is there a particular set of vocabulary words that students must know to gain these literacies?
Oh, absolutely. In education, we call it academic language. I think of necessary academic language for ELA students in sort of three sections. There's the vocabulary of writing as a function of writing as a way of organizing ideas and writing as a communicative tool. Vocabulary of writing as a function are specific vocabulary that are parts that make up the machine of writing, things like verbs and nouns. Vocabulary of writing as a way of organizing ideas are structural elements of writing, things like introduction, paragraphs, using quotations. And then the vocabulary of writing as a communicative tool are the elements of writing most closely related to sort of author or style, or author or story style. Theme, narrative, voice, tone, things like that all fall under the vocabulary of writing as a communicative tool. Students must engage with these vocabularies of writing selections to have a strong understanding of ELA academic language.
Say a student has a working understanding of these literacies and these modes of academic language. What is the benefit of having these things beyond getting good grades? Does this apply to their lives outside of school?
You know, that's something that I wondered myself as a ELA student, particularly in high school. There was never a deliberate connection made between argumentative essay writing, say, in high school, and the world outside the walls of my classroom. And I think that has changed since I was in school, and I want to support that change by further making those connections for students, which is part of the cultural accessibility that I was talking about earlier. Let's think about a student who is literate in ELA traits that I spoke of earlier, ELA literacies, and who are working knowledge of academic language that is appropriate for the developmental stage, and how those traits breed equity and access for that student. The student is able to approach multiple information platforms and synthesize understanding of those platforms, creating a new idea from what from that synthesis, a trait that any employer would want. Students who are well-versed in argumentative literacies will have the ability to speak thoughtfully on a subject, presenting specific and defendable stances on the subject, which is another trait that is very applicable to the job market. Students that understand excuse me, the academic language of English language arts understand how to articulate communication and how communication functions, and that's a strength that supports synthesis and argumentative literacy as well, because having all these skills allows student equity, and that they will now have the strengths that will at the very least equal the skill sets of their peers, allowing them to compete against their peers in an academic setting and when they get on the real world. And students will have a great access to the world beyond their current living situation, because they will be able to articulate their wants and needs to the degree that they can get those needs met, whereas previously, if they do not have that skill set with the multiple literacies and the use of academic language, it will be more difficult for them to understand what their needs are and articulate what those needs are to others. And being able to compete for scholarships at school or jobs in the job market is the ultimate way to create equity and access for oneself, because you have a universal skill set, sort of a cognitive Swiss Army knife that you can use ultimately anywhere.
Now, Alex, how will your pedagogical approach integrate literacy in the classroom instruction for facets of content understanding?
My pedagogical approach, personally, is based on achieving literacy, and each facet of content understanding will present it in a way that students will have a clear understanding of how that course content supports the development of ELA literacy goals that I've outlined earlier. I know that it sounds a little lofty to sort of have such a hard stance on how I would structure curriculum in my classroom, but I recently crossed paths with the idea of backward design, where teachers choose learning outcomes first and then construct those lessons backwards, choosing acceptable evidence after learning objectives, and then lastly organizing class periods around support of the evidence for assessment and these learning outcomes. And I feel that doing that backwards design, I will craft learning outcomes that will always being mindful of English literacy and putting those ideas first, synthesis literacy, argumentative literacy, and English language literacy. And I will always be able to present classroom instruction that uses content understanding that supports that literacy.
Now, where does learning theory fit into how much emphasis content has in supporting literacy?
Constructivism is close to my heart, as it is how I always like to think I function as a learner, taking in prompts, school and in life, and seeking out an opportunity to construct my own knowledge instead of waiting for that knowledge to sort of be absorbed. I think constructivism fits well with my personal pedagogical stance and how I would structure learning through the achievement of ELA literacies. English literacy is the foundation that students must know to be able to engage with English language arts, and synthesis literacy and argumentative literacy are very much constructivist concepts, where students draw from a personally developed and understood funds of knowledge and prior knowledge to engage with the prompt. When students are using these literacies outside of the structure of school, they will very likely use these literacies in a different way than someone who sat in the exact same classrooms with them through their whole academic career, because they constructed a personalized understanding of those prompts that were presented in those classes. Those same non-school prompts will see very different outcomes depending on the student and the constructivist supports for the potential of those occurring in this manner. So I think that by sort of having constructivism at the forefront of how I will apply these my pedagogical approach allows for that different adaptation of classroom content to the outside world, and supports that, and doesn't try to force students to have a identical understanding of class content, because that, of course, is impossible.
I'd like to thank my guest, Alex Dwyer. I've been doing this for a long time, and I think he is definitely got the goods to become a fantastic teacher.
Thank you very much, Alex. This has really been a pleasure, and I'd like to come back when I've finished the program.
Please tune in with us next week, and have